Hi there, and welcome to the Creative Operations Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Groom, and in this podcast, we'll be talking with creative operations leaders in all kinds of industries, from franchising to finance, from healthcare to hospitality and beyond. We'll be looking to uncover best practices and to see trends that are coming to help you keep your creative operations on brand and on budget at the same time. Enjoy. Hey, welcome everybody to Creative Operations 2.0, the podcast. And it is my great pleasure today to say that we have with us Stephen Gates. Stephen is the founder of CRZY. I hope I'm saying that right. CRZY, which is a strategy, design, and inspiration studio. And Stephen brings to us today just a wealth of background in all matters and issues concerned with design. So, of course, being creative operations, we're going to focus on just one small segment of what I think is kind of a vast realm of experience and some really exciting stuff too. So Stephen, first, apologies for only focusing on a small portion of all the things that you might be able to weigh in on for us. But we're really pleased to have you. So welcome.
Well, no, thanks so much for having me. I think, look, I've always been one of those designers, creatives, leaders, whatever, that loves operations. It's usually one of the first teams I've started in a lot of places I've been. So no, more than happy to play in this space today.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for that. We always like to start for the audience with just a little background and give you the chance, I guess, to maybe opine a little bit about your history in operations and also where you see its role today. Both those things, I think, is where it would be a great place for us to begin today.
Yeah. So I think, my background's been, I don't think anybody would look at my resume and tell you like the path I took was a good idea. I've worked across advertising in-house. I worked at Starwood Hotels and Citibank and Weight Watchers and Envision and a bunch of other places. But I think, I've always been a big believer in operations because I think, one of the things I saw really early on was if you want to have great ideas, if you want to change an industry, if you want to do something that really is going to have an impact, it's like great ideas are fragile. And you need to create the space. You need the structure. You need the way of working to be able to let those ideas really sort of find the light of day and to be able to do that. And I think you need to have structures and rules in place and operations and a lot of those things to be able to let that stuff go out the door. And I think I also am self-aware enough to know that that's not one of the things that I'm like, I can do it enough to be dangerous, but I need help in that place. And I think, whenever I was at Envision, I was one of the co-authors of the design maturity report we did there. That was the biggest look at the impact on design and creativity on business. And you can absolutely see that one of the hallmarks of the best teams, the hallmarks of whenever you watch teams sort of come out of low maturity to mediocre maturity, is whenever they start to get operations teams, because it's when they start to define what they need to be successful. And it's usually a real hallmark moment for them. But I think that's one of the moments we're still struggling with, because a lot of the people I know who are, some companies that I talk to, they call it operations. Some are program management. Some are project management. Some are, right? So I think there's still not a clear understanding of what it is, of what its benefit is, which I think, again, goes a bit in hand where the number one question I still get asked is sort of, how can we prove the business impact of design? But I think it's so essential. And I think this is where, design and a lot of marketing teams and things like that are struggling to truly be the peers of the partners they work with.
That's a really interesting perspective. What we see, we've been doing this for about 20 years. And in the early years, and actually, we share a little bit of history because I was actually at Apple when the CRZY ones, the poem and really the launch spot that led to the Think Different campaign. I was actually there as Jobs was really coming back after that horrific interregnum with John Scully, I think it was. Through that entire time period, we found operations struggling to achieve that peer-like status. To say that, and I love the quote, good ideas are fragile. I love that as a place to begin, because very often what operations is meant to do is steward the brand, to deploy the brand and activate those messages and do so in a way, I often talk about it as a logistical equation, right? We're trying to get that package, that intellectual package somewhere out in the marketplace without it getting bruised, dented, damaged along the way, and so creative operations, marketing operations, we've heard lots of different vocabulary. it has been evolving for all those decades and still seems to have a ways to go. A lot of what you just said seems to me to kind of very much sync up with what we heard at the in-house agency forum just a couple months ago, where we see, operations teams at really proud brands still fighting for that equal place at the table. So just a question for you, and maybe this is more an organizational question than it is a design question. How do you think an operations leader steps into that role where they've got an equal seat at the table, knowing that they are downstream of brand and strategy and all that, but that they're essential to it? How does a leader do that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really good question. And I think it's interesting. I knew a really, really senior executive at Apple who would always describe operations. Well, he described the entire company as like a swan going across a pond. Right. What the world sees is what's above the water, this big, majestic sort of gliding, glowing thing. What the company is what's below the water, which is a lot of like thrashing and sort of craziness. And operations is the water line. Right. It's the thing that normalizes and kind of makes everything look good before the public sees it. But I think in a lot of cases, for me, whenever I talk to leaders that are in that position, I think one is definitely to be able to take the time to, I think, understand what your peers are going through, what is keeping them up at night, to be able to understand what the business challenges are. The second thing for me is I think it's very, very important that you define, again, treat yourself like an operations product, define what you need to be successful. Because I think I see too many operations teams, too many design teams, and too many leaders that are just sort of taking whatever they're given and they're making the best of it. So whenever I go in and talk to them and say, okay, like what are the things you need to do great work? And they'll say, we need these 5 things. And I'm like, okay, great. How often are you getting those? Or how many do you get? And they'll say 2. It's like, okay, well, it's not hard to see why that's going on. But I think that, one of the biggest things that I see a lot of leaders struggle with when they're in that position, when you're trying to sort of get that seat at the table, is to really remember that in that moment, the biggest thing you need is a plan, not necessarily the answer. Because I think a lot of leaders in that place, they feel like I need to have it all figured out. I need to be able to understand what this is. That's not the way we solve problems. I think that what you need to be able to do is to say, we're going to do these things. This is how we're going to bring the organization along. This is what we're going to do. And then use time. But I think a lot of people will get silent or a little bit paralyzed because they don't feel like they have it all figured out. And usually in that vacuum, operations is one of those places where I think a lot of people feel like they are entitled to come in and play and have an opinion. And so usually in that silence, the organization will come rushing in and try to define too much of your organization. So I think, again, being able to say, this is what we're doing or this is where we're headed, usually will sort of keep the barbarians at the gate a little bit more and give you the time to solve the problems, to build the trust. Because I think in a lot of cases, operations and design aren't that different. Our currency that we trade in really is trust and sort of confidence, so that whenever we go into something, people are like, well, the timeline is tight, or I don't know if we can do it, or there's a lot of problems, but I believe that this leader can figure it out because they have in the past. I think whenever you understand that that's the currency you're trading in, you can quickly get a seat at that table and become their peers.
That's fascinating. I love the notion of trading in trust. What we've seen a lot is that the operations folks have a history that they have to shed, a history to mean, if you will, not to use a popular cultural term, but sort of a handmaiden to brand and design, as opposed to really a natural and seamless extension that really takes art to make it work, right? And so in shedding that baggage, they have to be able to win the trust that there's a bigger role for them to play, more of a strategic and a structural role. And so what we've spent a lot of time in, and we often find that we backed our way into this, is the operations leader can define systems, both workflow systems and technology systems, that then become the platform that creates the plan on which trust can now be earned. Does that make sense to you that, technology being a realm for operations is a great way to earn that seat at the table?
No, I think 100%, because, look, I think a lot of times what you do is, I think it absolutely makes a ton of sense. And I think the only two caveats I would put on that, I think one is to make sure whenever you're putting those systems in place that you are taking the time to socialize and define so that people understand what those are in service of. Because I think, that's often the case, is whenever people are just going through and checking boxes,
Yeah.
That oftentimes the process isn't necessarily working. So I think, operations is one in particular. I think if you ask 10 different people in a company what operations does, you get 8 different answers. Mm-hmm. So I think, making sure you go through and to be able to do that roadshow for them for sure. But I think, the other part of it for me that I think the creation of the process is really great. But for me, it's the adoption of it. It's the fact that making sure that it's a living thing, that it's a conversation, that again, we define what are the parts that aren't negotiable? What are the parts where you can look at, okay, culturally, maybe your team can adopt this part or run it a little bit differently. But I think that's the part is whenever they start to internalize it, it just becomes a part of it. That in a lot of cases, whenever I've done operations or design methodologies, I almost launch them a little bit more like a social movement than launching a process, because I want people engaged and believing in it and seeing the benefits. And again, so it's a little bit of a different approach than just sort of saying, okay, look, here are the steps.
Yeah, I get it. I entirely get it. I mean, I think we just have to advertise and capture folks emotionally as much internally as we do externally. I've always said, when we see the brand refresh, Think Different is a great example of this. Yeah. When I was at Apple and the Think Different campaign came out, it transformed the employee community first. People walked with a different kind of swagger. And at a time when Apple was not walking with swagger at all, and so that very same notion that you're not launching a system, you are launching a new kind of culture is a really great point, and something that I think in-house agency leaders can really, they can take ownership of that in a way. And I think as another way of getting an equal seat at the table. They may not be, driving the brand at the consumer level or the B2B customer level. But transforming the organization from the inside out is something that I think, really gives you some street cred, with your colleagues in brand and design. And all of this, Stephen, I think we have to have this against the backdrop that over the past, let's say 15 to 20 years, we have seen, I think the ANA is telling us 75% of major brands have dramatically amped up their in-house agencies. Mm-hmm. Great trend. But a trend that I think has been perceived as being a cost-cutting measure rather than what I think a cultural change and really a force multiplier in terms of having intimacy around the brand. And we're losing a huge opportunity when the in-house agency and the operations folks don't take that equal seat at the table. Right. So we're touching on really, really big and rich topics. Want to turn to something because you used another great phrase. By the way, you are a rich provider of great phrases. I think you speak in T-shirts, which is what good design and advertising people always do. But you talked about barbarians at the gate.
Yeah.
Now, if you put yourself in the role of the operations folks, sitting there looking at a bunch of different stakeholders, upstream, senior management, upstream brand and strategy, upstream sales very often, and downstream, at least in our environments, we work with a great many distributed brands, mm-hmm. local marketers, franchisees, resellers, agents. And those barbarians are different. They're almost a horde to be policed rather than masters to be served. I wanted to just get your thoughts on when you've got that horde out there, doesn't have the sensitivity to the kinds of issues and the kinds of impact that you've spent your career, really helping organizations to build. How do you as an operations or from an operations perspective, how do you make sure they understand that this is not a matter of being policed? It's a matter of, all pulling on the same oars in the same direction. How do you go about doing that?
It's a really good question. I think so. I mean, that's a problem. I lived for almost 10 years at Starwood Hotels because we had 12 different brands, right? And so I think you had, W or St. Regis as the global brand and then the individual markets. I've seen it. And now I work with automotive. I think that a lot of it for me has always been freedom and a framework, because I think you're always going to have two very different perspectives, right? Upstream executives, marketing, things like that, they're going to care about the bigger picture, the bigger brand. They want consistency. They want, whenever I go into a social media platform and I type in our brand and I see all of those distributed different locations, that this all looks like one company. But I think the downstream, whenever you talk to an automotive dealer or a hotel, right? Like they have very immediate, very, very close in problems. Yeah. And so I think one is definitely making sure you're doing education with the downstream, with those sort of markets, so that they're sure that they understand what the impact is, why this matters, that there's a bigger picture. I used to describe it as a sports analogy that, we're all on a team and we need to make sure we're playing for the team name on the front, not your name on the back. And that, that doesn't mean that you don't play a role. It doesn't mean that there is not a place and we want you to be successful, but that, again, that it is the whole and the bigger thing that's going on that's bringing everybody into this. We'd actually gone so far as one of the things we actually started to do was to really almost establish like what was the marketing IQ of the downstream hotels or the car dealerships, because I think it was such an operational nightmare. And honestly, I think we looked at it from an operations perspective. We realized it's not one problem, right? We don't have all these individual little marketers that are at the same maturity level. So what we would do is we would actually basically give them a quiz and say, how much do you understand this? How much do you understand operations? How much do you understand marketing? And then based on that maturity, it would unlock how much control could they have over their part of the brand. So very high maturity, you can do your own posts. You can do all this stuff. You can do your own photography. Very low maturity, there were a lot more of the training wheels came on, because I think that that's often the case, is that getting to sort of that level of sophistication, or to sort of do a multi-tiered operations response so that we understand we don't have one problem. That's where we found a lot of success, because then one, it gave the lower maturity sort of parts of that cohort a reason to want to mature, a reason to want to do better. That again, the assumption everybody was in equal footing was a false assumption.
That's a great point. In our registration process, we work a great deal with restaurant franchisees to have those folks who often will register independently because the master brand really has a kind of a loose connection to them. Mm-hmm. There are thousands of them. And so their connection to the master brand is very much a day-to-day thing. But to walk those guys not simply through a registration process, but through a qualification process, right, so that then our brand can define the roles, permissions, and really campaigns that a user has access to, and what fields are locked and what fields are unlocked, what images are curated for them, and what images can they upload on their own. Those kinds of questions could be answered, I think, based on this idea you have of marketing IQ. I love it. Have you ever created something that lets people quantify their marketing IQ?
Yeah, no, that was literally what we did. And I think a lot of it was going through and basically sort of taking a quiz to unlock that. There was a way, if you wanted to dispute it or something like that, you could talk to a person to be able to do that. But no, I think that, and a lot of what it was really positioning to get them to understand that we're trying to make them the most successful, right? This isn't about judgment. Right. This isn't about trying to shame them for where they are. It's just trying to say, look, we're trying to put you in the position to get the most qualified leads, to get the most business, to get the most conversions, to be able to do what that is, and then also create a path for how could they get better. And I think whenever you sort of say, okay, look, here's the goal and it's in service of the business and the bottom line, then everybody was like, oh, that's great. And actually having to do a lot of this stuff was stressing us out or causing us money or wasting time. And so again, I think that really calm that ecosystem down, because I think, if not, the problem is either it becomes like a police state where you're constantly going around and scolding everybody, or it's sort of like the British police, right? Or you tend to have an organization or operations that has a process in place, but if it's not being followed, there's not really any teeth to it, right? So it's like I said, it's sort of like stop, or I'm going to tell you to stop again. There's not really a consequence. So I think that ability to bring in some consequence, bring in results, be able to bring in education to show them why it works, that way for us, again, and it's a model I've repeated with a number of different businesses, because I think it really does land and really does work well.
That's great. I love the notion of consequence and the notion of being the brand bobbies. Now we can say that is not an attractive place to be.
No.
Well, let me turn last topic and something that we've heard a ton in podcasts like this, not as much down out in the field, when we're really looking at individual customers and all of their users. But upstairs, we're hearing a lot about AI. And I wanted to chat a little bit about AI, both in terms of generative design and also content creation, text and image, manufacturing and content. As a copywriter, so, I spent my life writing words that then designers, treat as cool bands of gray type. And there's a risk, I think, that AI is going to get mischaracterized either as a panacea or as sort of another instance of barbarians, a different kind of barbarian at the gate. Where do you fall on this? Do you see promise in these increasing tools and automation for increasing intelligence, or do you see them kind of as threats, or do you see both?
What I would say is I feel like we're sort of at a broader moment where there's a lot of technologies that have potential. I think whenever you look at voice assistants or like there's a lot of different things out there that I think have a lot of potential. I think AI is in a place right now where it's a really good assistant. It's really good at automation. It's really good at, if you're able to give it some guardrails and to be able to say, okay, look, I need production help or I need to be able to run an algorithm to enhance a photo. No, I absolutely think that there's potential there. But look, but I'd also say I think it's funny how we seem to make old problems new ones, because I think, like, at least for me, I've gone through that with the desktop publishing. I've gone through that with web. I've gone through, like, there's always been these shifts where it's sort of like, now everything's going to be magical and now everything's going to be and it isn't, right? And I think, is there going to be a requirement to shift the skill set to be able to adapt to that and work in a new way? Absolutely. Is it going to be a different tool that's going to displace some and empower others? Of course. And I think that right now, again, AI is in a place where it's very good as a tool inside of guardrails. I think it's starting to emerge. If you look at the recent trend with everybody, getting 900 different versions of their portrait with apps like Lensa that would sort of create different versions of the art. Can you start to see the potential of that? Yes. Is there a value proposition there right now? Probably not. But again, I think it's the way that I've always approached this. And I think the way I've been able to stay successful in my career, I look at these like pencils. That these are communication tools, that these are, at the end of the day, a pencil into itself is not going to make me successful. It is a tool that I can use. It is the mark I make. It is the way that I use it. It is the input that I give it. It is the output of what is that ultimately determines how successful I am. And so again, I think, that tool set is going to continue to evolve, because I think just we're in an era where change is the constant. So yeah, there's a lot of technologies that I think are going to shift and be able to help that landscape. But and again, I think that there is great promise if you can look at the promise of a chatbot or something like that to help offload some of the operations pieces, to be able to offload some of how the monitoring of what's going on, of due dates, of a lot of things like that. So again, I think that there are benefits that I don't think we've quite realized for how it can bring value into the space. But that's why I said, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be another tool that it's not going to wreck an industry, but it's also not going to be its savior.
Plus ça change. It makes really good sense. We're starting as the kind of the keepers of the assets, and hopefully the deployers of those assets in an intelligent way, to begin putting those tools into very controlled use, right? Very, very controlled, simply because if we let it out, what we've found over the years, and I think the trends you're talking about, we are simply another iteration of those in terms of local marketing automation. What we found is that the urge to democratize is great and should be supported, and philosophically is something that we need to get behind. But the method by which we do that democratization is the key to success, and the key to preventing a backlash from those folks upstairs, because we have barbarians, some of them very powerful and some of them just very numerous, but we have both on both sides of the equation. So making sure that democratization occurs in a controlled environment is a great way to prevent the backlash, because the backlash would be a sign, going back to the head of our conversation, of eroding trust. Right. Yeah. And trust clearly is how we keep, once we've won the seat at the table, how we keep that seat as operations professionals. So that was just a really entertaining review. And hopefully we kind of came full circle, Stephen. I want everybody to know StephenGates.com. It's a fascinating website. This is a fascinating history, and it's been a really engaging discussion, Stephen. So thank you for taking 20 minutes with us. We really appreciate it.
No. Thank you so much for having me. Always love talking about any of this stuff. Happy to help anybody out there that's struggling with any of that. Feel free to reach out. But no, thanks so much for having me.
You betcha. Thank you. And have a great day.
Thanks.